Okay, welcome to Encore Learning Presents. My name is David Tate, and I'm a volunteer on the special events committee, which elections happens to be our topic today. But the committee works hard to bring you these interesting speakers, such as we have today. And if you're interested in joining in on the fun, please send a note to info@encorelearning.net expressing your interest. We would love to have you join us and help out in this endeavor. And you may be joining us here today, sitting at home with the simple goal of escaping the heat, or you may be a political junkie like me. Whatever the reason, we appreciate your attendance. As many of you know, Virginia has elections every year. It just so happens that this year the rest of the nation is joining us, but today our focus will be on Virginia politics and the rich history and the political transformation that has occurred and is actually still in progress. But before we actually get started and introduce our speaker today, I just want to make sure that everyone knows how to use the technology, and we do that with. Whoops, I missed a slide. Why is there not a slide there? Oh, here it is, out of order. But anyway, we do that with our modern version of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. In other words, explaining things you probably already know. But like Sigourney Weaver in the Galaxy Quest movie, it's my job to do it. And by golly, I'm going to get it done. So here we go. First of all, we take questions through the Q&A function, not the chat. We've actually disabled the chat for Zoom bombing purposes. So to submit your question, just find the Q&A icon, click on it, type in your question, and hit submit or hit send. We will have it. We're not going to actually pose the questions to our speaker until the very end, but you can put the questions in whenever they occur to you, and we'll just hold on to them and deal with them at the end. We also have what we call live transcript or closed captions. Now, that should be an option on your screen. Keep in mind that's under your control. It's whether it appears or it doesn't appear. So if you want it or don't want it, find that icon and make your choice. Also, when you leave the webinar or when we're finished, you'll see a request for a survey. It's very brief. I think it's one question. So please take it. It'll help us out. And if you have any technical problems, send an email to info@encorelearning.net. And one other thing before we, oh wait, did I pull up the wrong? Well, anyway, we do have, I think okay, we have, oh, here we go. Sorry. Yeah, so just want to let you know of our next presentation, Saving Worldwide Cultural Heritage in Crisis. And we will have with us, this is on July 15th, again at 3 o'clock. We'll have Dr. Richard Curran, who founded the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative to help save and restore cultural heritage items, many of which are at risk right now with the war and all the natural disasters. So please tune in, and you'll learn all about how they go about doing that. So with that, let me stop sharing this and introduce our speaker today. So we have with us today John Milliken. He is currently a senior fellow in residence at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University right here in Arlington, Virginia, having concluded more than 5 decades of service as a public official and private attorney. And from his formative years growing up in Leesburg, Virginia, he's been schooled, continually schooled in politics, beginning with his mother, who was very connected in Virginia politics. Beginning in 1975, John served as the chief of staff to Virginia's Congressman Joseph L. Fisher, and was elected in 1980 as a member of the Arlington County Board, stepping down in the middle of his 3rd term to accept the position of Secretary of Transportation in the administration of Governor Doug Wilder. During his years on the Arlington Board, he was a member of the WMATA Board and the Transportation Planning Board of the Council of Governments. More recently, he served as chairman of the Board of Commissioners of Virginia Port Authority under 6 Virginia governors, concluding his service only in 2022. So you can see, not only is he born and raised in Virginia, he has firsthand experience of the politics and how they have changed. And with his recent book, he returns to the study of Virginia politics and government. A journey began during his years at Haverford College and the University of Virginia School of Law. So please, everyone, give a warm virtual welcome to John Milliken. John, I'm gonna get your slides up here and
okay.
Hopefully this will work. Here we go. Sure. Okay, those should be up.
Yep. You can actually flip to the second one, the next one, if you want.
Okay. Okay.
As David said, this is a presentation about 20th century Virginia history and politics. And I think of it as the story of two Virginias, the Virginia that I grew up in, and perhaps others in the audience as well, where I grew up in a small rural town, what was then a small rural town, and that Virginia has disappeared. And the Virginia we live in Arlington or Fairfax or wherever, is the Virginia of today. Go on to the next one.
Let's see if I can. Okay.
Next slide. Yep. It didn't happen quickly. It happened over a decade, over the better part of a century. So one way to think about it is to take a look at the profile for Virginia in 1920, 100 years ago. We were a population of 2.3 million, still one of the larger states at that point. The percentage of African American in the community in 1920 was nearly 30%. And interestingly and importantly, the percentage of people living in Virginia in 1920 who had been born in Virginia was 84%. And many of the remainder had been born in nearby West Virginia or North Carolina or Maryland, where there perhaps were better or more convenient hospitals than where the newborn would be living in Virginia. That was true, for example, of Governor, longtime Senator Harry Byrd. He was actually born in West Virginia, as were many of the people who lived in the Shenandoah Valley, his part of the Shenandoah Valley. So in those days, there really only was one political party. Nominally, there was a second one, but it didn't win anything and didn't have any office holders. So there was one political party. And because there was only one, and because of some things we'll talk about, the participation in elections was very small. As you see in 1921, in the gubernatorial election of 21, only 12.5% of the age-eligible electorate actually participated. Next slide. To understand current Virginia, we'll start in 1902 with the adoption of the 1902 Constitution. If you go back a little bit, obviously Virginia came out of the Civil War. Its economy was destroyed. Many of its younger people had been killed or injured during the war. So it was in bad shape. And Reconstruction, under the guidance of the federal government, brought a period of reform to Virginia and opened up Virginia politics in ways that the ruling planter class in Virginia then had never seen. And that led to a reaction. And that reaction resulted in the 1902 Constitution. And as the quote tells you, the real purpose of the 1902 Constitution was to narrow the electorate first and foremost by depriving African American citizens who had been very active and in office during much of Reconstruction, to deprive them of the opportunity to vote. And they did that in two principal ways. One, by instituting a poll tax. And that meant in order to vote, in order to register to vote, you had to pay a tax. It had to be paid 3 years in arrears, and you had to pay it, or think about paying it, and actually pay it 6 months in advance. So it took some conscious decision on your part as a citizen to participate in an election that perhaps at that point was sometime off in the distance. And even if you were willing to do that, and particularly if you were African American, or perhaps a person whom the local organization, the local power structure thought suspect in your views, you could, under the 1902 Constitution, be asked to explain a section of the 1902 Constitution that would be picked at random by the local registrar. And it was the local registrar's power, discretionary power, to decide whether your recital about that part of the Constitution really evidenced understanding of what it meant. And, that was really a way to keep a significant share of the population from participating in the elections. And we'll see that in the next slide. In 1900, the total voting in the 1900 race, presidential race, 265,000, close to 264 and change. After the Constitution was enacted, that basically dropped by 50%, down to 130,000. And the biggest decline was in the percentage of the voting population that participated who were African American. Their percentage dropped by 93%. There was a decline in the white vote as well, but the changes in the Constitution were aimed at keeping African American citizens from voting, and they were very effective. Next slide. You see it again in the numbers, the number of people registered in various cities before and after the 1902 Constitution. In the city of Richmond, the white vote fell off from 12,000 to 9,000, but the African American vote fell off from 6,000 to under 1,000. Petersburg, similar numbers. Norfolk, similar numbers. Next slide. The person who became both the beneficiary and then the spokesman for a lot of these attitudes was a then state senator, newspaper publisher, apple orchardist from Winchester, Virginia, named Harry Flood Bird. He succeeded his father in politics, took the seat in the state legislature that his father had held, and benefited from both his father's and his uncle's participation in the politics of Virginia preceding him. He became the youngest governor in Virginia history at 38 years of age. And then after his gubernatorial term concluded, at the next available U.S. Senate election, he ran for and was elected to the United States Senate, and served there for better than 20 years. Most importantly to our story, he was the patriarch, the leader, the single most important figure in what became known as the Byrd political machine. He had, as the principles of his service, both as governor and as senator, he was a tight-fisted, pay-as-you-go conservative Democrat, and believed in the separation of the races. He was not a deep Southern demagogue. He wasn't what became a typical kind of Alabama governor like George Wallace, or South Carolina Pitchfork Ben Tillman. He was much more genteel than that, much softer spoken than that, but his views were very similar. His governorship was, by most accounts, a very successful one, in the sense that he reshaped and modernized state government. It also served his interests to do so. Among other things, for example, he reduced the number of offices that were elected statewide, and instead made several of those positions appointive by the governor. He really created the modern Virginia governor, which is one of the more powerful governorships in the country. And in doing so, he benefited from it, as did his successors, by reorganizing state government. In 1930, after his term had concluded, the Virginia that was the population of Virginia had grown a little bit, but its demographics was very much the same as it had been before. It was largely rural. It was largely made up of people who'd been born in the state, and its structure was built around the core of what was called a courthouse crowd in each of the rural counties around the state. Flip to the next slide.
Yeah, John, we do have a question that maybe is worth taking now on some of the voting percentages. I think it's be instructive to really hone in on just how profound the voter suppression was. And sorry about that. Here, Greg asked, did the 1921 voting percentage of 12.5% include eligible blacks, or perhaps only to the extent that they met the owner's voting requirements? I can go back to that slide. I think maybe this is like,
it's the prior one to that.
Okay, maybe
this one is that.
Well, I don't. Did we have one that? Well, actually, I
yeah.
don't know.
Well, I know that's way back. That's way back in the beginning. Yeah, that's the
19...
percentage of.
Okay.
That is the percentage of people who would be eligible to vote because they met the age requirement, whether or not they were registered. In other words, this is a percentage of the eligible electorate.
And then you have percentage who voted. Oh, this is who percentage who voted in 1921, 12.5%. So I guess the question is, that is a percentage of the 690,000?
No. It's a percentage of the eligible electorate of the 2.3 million. I don't I don't know how many were age eligible out of the total Virginia population, but of the
Okay.
age eligible people, black, white, everybody, 12.5% voted in 1921.
Oh, okay. So that's not just honing in on the black vote. Okay. Okay.
No, 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 no.
Okay.
And because, as if you'll now skip ahead to the to back to where we were, one of the principles of the organization and one of the keys to its success is controlling the size of the electorate. You let me decide who votes, and I'll tell you the outcome. And they took that principle and lived by it successfully for almost 50 years. And you'll see here, I think you got to go back one more slide before we get to this one. Nope, I'm wrong. Okay, go ahead.
Okay.
That over the average turnout over a 4-year cycle, presidential year, gubernatorial year, congressional year, local election year, the average turnout for that 25-year period when the organization was in its heyday was 11.5%. And this was in the Democratic primary, which is all that mattered. The turnout in the general election in the fall in state office races was even lower than that. So the organization, its strength came from the rural communities, particularly in the southern tier of the state, particularly in those communities that happen to have large percentages of African American citizens living there, even though they didn't vote. Those were the areas of strength of the organization. And economically, the state was dominated by the largely agricultural products produced in those areas of the state. The tobacco farms, the timber and textile interests all along the North Carolina border, and then up into the Shenandoah Valley with the smaller farms and orchards. Locally, the organization would rely on the elected officials called constitutional officers. And they're called that because the offices are spelled out in the 1902 Constitution and still in the Constitution that we have today. They are the Commonwealth Attorney, the Sheriff, the Commissioner of Revenue, the Treasurer, and the Clerk of the Court. Those were the local leaders in the organization. And through them, the organization controlled the electoral process and up to the state level. By and large, they provided corruption-free, reasonably responsible government, well managed, but by purposeful intention, they did very little. They were not interested in governing to results. They were interested in governing as a limiting factor on people's lives in one degree or another. Next slide. Mm-hmm. The organization, very tightly organized, very successfully controlled through two key lieutenants of Senator Byrd. Ebby Combs was an ally and friend and lieutenant for Byrd his entire career, and he held two positions off and on for the better part of 30 plus years. He was the head of what was called the State Compensation Board. And the State Compensation Board set the amount of money to be given from state funds to each of the constitutional offices in every jurisdiction in the state. So whether it was the Arlington Clerk of the Court or the Mecklenburg County Commonwealth Attorney or the treasurer of the city of Norfolk. Didn't matter. The constitutional offices looked to the state compensation board to have their expenses reimbursed and their salaries paid to the extent that they didn't get them out of some local fee, such as the clerk of the court's various filing fees. So Ebby Combs had that hat, and he served as the clerk of the state senate and sort of managed the state senate on behalf of Senator Byrd, whether Byrd was then serving as governor or later serving in the Senate. On the other side, the Speaker of the House of Delegates was a neighbor and close ally of Byrd's named Blackie Moore, and he managed on a day-to-day basis the House of Delegates. The key figure locally typically was the local circuit judge. Often that person was a former legislator, appointed to that office by the state Senate and the House of Delegates, by the legislature, and serving an 8-year term and then subject to reappointment by that state Senate and House of Delegates. The circuit judge had two powers that were important to the organization. One was he appointed the local electoral board. He also appointed the board of real estate assessors and what was called the school trustee, and the school trustee in turn appointed the school board. But the circuit judge also had the power to fill the office from any constitutional officer who died during their term. So the rule of thumb in the organization was die in office, because that created a vacancy that the organization through the circuit judge could fill. And there would always be an organization supported constitutional officer in that position. The guiding principle was never have an election for a constitutional office where there's not an incumbent. And the circuit judge was responsible for making sure that that was almost always the case. The key, as we said, to the organization's control was turnout. And they did that by successfully catering to the needs of their base. And in the 30s and 40s, when Harry Byrd had moved on to the Senate, but people he supported were successive governors during that entire period, they held every political office in the state. No Republican was elected to statewide office until 1969. All throughout the 20th century, there were only Democrats in statewide office, and only 4 members out of 140 members of the state legislature were Republican, 2 in the Senate and 2 in the House of Delegates. Next slide. Again, the percentage of the voting age population participating in the Democratic primary, and that was where the race typically was. Republicans rarely put up a candidate of any seriousness. These are the governor's turnout levels from 1925 up through 1957. Every now and then in the Democratic primary, like 1949, there was a serious challenge to the organization from more liberal forces, but they didn't do very well. They didn't win. The Republican Party began to emerge in the early 50s after Eisenhower's election to the presidency, but the turnout was so dismal that they didn't do very well either. The uh, a small but vocal group of self-described national Democrats began to take issue with Byrd after he refused to support the Democratic nominees for president, beginning with Harry Truman. He broke with Harry Truman after Truman ordered the integration of the armed services. That was not something that Byrd could support. And beginning in 1948, he adopted a policy in presidential elections of what he called golden silence. That is, he just didn't say anything, leaving his supporters around the state free to go their own way. And increasingly, in the 1950s, they began to vote Republican. It was in 1949 when this group of national Democrats made that challenge to Byrd, but their candidate, Francis Pickens Miller, a well-known international figure, former ambassador, well supported among the liberal forces in Virginia, but there weren't very many of those. While he put a little bit of a scare into the organization, he certainly succeeded. What Harry Byrd did in that 1949 election, in the final week, he made some appeals to Republicans to enter the Democratic primary in support of the more conservative alternative, and they did, and that probably had a significant impact on the outcome. Next slide. The so-called anti-organization vote was centered in three places, and each of the three corners of the state, in each for a different reason. The common denominator being that they were the parts of Virginia most geographically remote to Richmond. And not only were they remote geographically, but they really had very little in common with Richmond. Southwest Virginia had been a part of the state that had not gone along with secession, although they stayed with the state, unlike the counties immediately to their north, who seceded and went into created the state of West Virginia. Southwest Virginia was a hotbed of anti-organization support. Northern Virginia, still fairly modest in numbers of people, was a hotbed of anti-organization politics, because they really didn't, most of them didn't agree with, didn't understand, didn't have a sense of history with what came out of Richmond. It was clear the machine was weakening, the organization was losing strength, but it got saved. Ironically, it got saved by the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement, which Harry Byrd did everything he could do to resist, really gave the organization another 10 years of life, because it instilled a fear among the Byrd supporting base that they followed in terms of their of the levels of support that he got in elections. And after the Supreme Court decision in 1954 and the Byrd organization's adoption of something that came to be known as massive resistance, the reaction to the emerging civil rights movement really gave life to the organization. Next slide. I think it's fair to say that that the 1954 decision and massive resistance are clearly the seminal event of the 20th century political of 20th century politics in Virginia. Uh, it put public education at the top of the state agenda, and it stayed there. It pushed a younger generation, many of whom had fought in World War II and came home to be uh, unsatisfied with the way things were being run back in their home state. People who might otherwise have gone into and been loyal soldiers in the organization really began to drift away from it. It cemented Northern Virginia disaffection. Northern Virginians really were not, for the most part, Virginians by heritage. They came from somewhere else. They came from a different culture, and they were turned off by a lot of the more vivid descriptions of massive resistance put forth by the organization. And importantly, it gave birth to the drive for greater African American political participation, which we'll talk about a lot later, and really reinvigorated or invigorated the Republican Party across the state. It can't be overemphasized how critical that series of events was. In support of Byrd and the organization, groups such as one called the Defenders of State Sovereignty and Individual Liberty emerged across the state, led in local communities, often by prominent lawyers, bankers, business people. This wasn't the anti-Negro Deep South. This wasn't the Klan, but it was thought to be a more respectable version of racial prejudice and animosity, but the result was often the same. Massive resistance really drove the politics throughout the 1950s, into and through most of the 1960s, and even into the early part of the 1970s. It was the dividing line in the single most important election in the 1960s, when the Byrd organization received its first defeat. It was an odd political year. It was 1966. And because Harry Byrd Sr. stepped down from his Senate seat, and the then governor appointed his son, Harry Byrd Jr., to succeed the father, state law required that U.S. Senate seat be put on the ballot in the next succeeding election. That would be 1966. That also happened to be the year when the term for the other U.S. Senator, A. Willis Robertson, came up. So you had both United States Senate seats on the same ballot in 1966, along with all of the seats in the Congress. That was the year in which the moderate and liberal forces in Virginia came together and succeeded in defeating Willis Robertson, electing a man named Bill Spong, who had been a moderate state senator from Portsmouth, an anti-organization leader in the state Senate before he was elected to the United States Senate. That same year, two members of Congress were defeated. The dean of the Virginia delegation, Howard W. Smith, Judge Smith, chairman of the House Rules Committee, was defeated in the Democratic primary by a liberal legislator named George Rawlings. And Pat Jennings, the Democratic congressman from Southwest Virginia, lost to a Republican in the fall. So that was really the first electoral outgrowth of the turmoil that was beginning as a result of massive resistance. And for the next decade, where you stood in massive resistance and where you had stood in that race became key to your success. But the two parties were beginning to reshape themselves and beginning to look a little bit more like their national counterparts. Next slide. On the Democratic side, the years 1969, 1970, up through the 1980 were not good Democratic years in Virginia, and not particularly good, with the exception of Jimmy Carter, nationally. In Virginia, those years were dominated by an unusual figure in Virginia politics, one of the few successful populists that Virginia has had in its politics, a man named Henry Howell. Henry Howell was a state senator from Norfolk and had been a leader in the anti-organization efforts for a number of years, and really ran for governor the first time in 1969, but lost in the Democratic primary to a combination of conservatives and moderates. Howell being the clear liberal in the race that year. The successful candidate in 69, Bill Battle, then lost to Linwood Holton, the Republican candidate for governor, in the fall of 1969, becoming the first Republican to be elected statewide in the 20th century. Howell continued to run, was elected in special election lieutenant governor in 1971 because of the death of the incumbent, but then lost in successive gubernatorial elections in both 73 and 77. So the Democrats did not have a good decade during the 1970s. The Republicans, on the other hand, next slide, they won the governorship in 1969, but then the party changed despite the incumbent governor, Linwood Holton. The party became a marriage of the remnants of the Byrd organization and the conservative wing of the Republican Party, crafted by a man named Dick Obenshain, who was tragically killed in an airplane accident a few years later. And Obenshain believed that the governing coalition in Virginia could and would be transformed if he could cement the alliance that he was putting together. And he did that by convincing a man named Mills Godwin to run again for governor, as he had in 1965. Mills Godwin, fascinating figure in the Virginia history. He both symbolized and accelerated the shift of former organization leaders into the Republican Party. He'd begun his career politically in the 1960s, in the 50s actually, as the spokesperson for the organization supporting massive resistance. He was the person who was most vocal, who led the effort in the state legislature to impose massive resistance and the closing of the schools. He then morphed and returned to elective politics as the kind of consensus Democrat running for governor in 1965 with strong support from the African American community, ironically, from the labor community, as well as from the moderate forces that then were a significant factor in Virginia politics. And all acknowledged that Godwin had a very successful term as governor, 1965 to 69. Now he's back running again in 1973, but this time as a Republican. And his message was, if you support me, I can keep that crazy populist Henry Howell out of the governorship and continue the same level of business-friendly government that we've had in Virginia for the better part of 5 decades. So he became the symbol of the morphing of the Republican Party into a coalition of the old bird organization and the conservative business community. So, next slide. This is a sort of quick run through of the politics. And so the question becomes, okay, how did we get from being the political museum piece that it was characterized by one historian, Virginia, as the political museum piece run by an oligarchy under Harry Byrd, to today's multicultural purple state. Next slide. Two things, two drivers of post-World War II political and economic Virginia. One, the growing participation of the African American population, and two, dramatic but geographically uneven population growth in the state. And I want to talk about each of those in turn. Next slide. African American population. Using 1930 as a snapshot, the African American population is concentrated in the areas that are shaded. The darker the shade, the higher the percentage. And many counties, particularly along the North Carolina border and up into sort of central Virginia, just west of Richmond, had majority African American populations. And that was changing even as early as 1930 with the migration of the African American population from Virginia, as well as from the deeper South, into the cities of the North. But still, in 1930 and again in 1940 and 1950, those communities that you see depicted on the slide retained significant shares of African Americans among the population. They didn't vote. And they didn't vote for some of the reasons that we talked about earlier: the poll tax, the registrar's reluctance to allow them to register, and using the tools that state law gave that registrar to say, well, that's not a sufficient explanation of that section of the Constitution. The registrar, to begin with, was often hard to find. If you were an African American or a newcomer into one of the counties along the North Carolina border, you didn't know who the registrar was. It wasn't you couldn't go on the website for the county. There wasn't such a thing. It was hard to find out who the registrar was, first. Second, you didn't know when the registrar would be open to accept registrations, because typically the registrar was a part-time person, and when he or she, frequently she, was registering voters, it was over in their kitchen, over the table, and maybe they'd be open on Tuesday from 3 to 5, or maybe not. So finding out who the registrar was, where the registrar was, and when the registrar would be open was your first challenge. Then, of course, you had to pay your poll tax. Then, if you got over those hurdles, you sat down with the registrar, and the registrar handed you a blank sheet of paper and then sat back, because the practice was that you were expected to know and be able to put on that blank sheet of paper all of the things that state law required you to give in information in order to register to vote. Some of them were obvious. Obviously, you gave your name, you gave your date of birth so that they know you were age eligible, you gave your address. Those things are fairly straightforward. You gave your employer, that was required, but you also had to give your last 2 or 3 addresses and your last 2 or 3 employers and the years of employment. Most people wouldn't think that that's something that you needed to write down on that blank piece of paper. And state law said the registrar wasn't prompting you. The registrar wasn't sitting there saying, here's the next question. The registrar was just there. And if you didn't fill out that form successfully and didn't give a proper understanding of the clause in the Constitution that the registrar gave to you, you wouldn't get registered that day. Obviously, highly discretionary. They registered the people that they wanted to register, the people that they thought would be reliable votes, and didn't register anybody else. So the number of African American voters grew very slowly, even in the cities where there were heavy African American populations, Richmond, Petersburg, Norfolk, very, very small percentages of African Americans were able to register to vote. Massive resistance, the closing of the schools, and all of the turmoil that resulted from that gave impetus to local efforts to change registration, to increase registration. In Richmond, in particular, a group of local leaders, often active in the NAACP, were very disappointed in the very low level of African American voting in the ballot initiative that was an effort to try to head off massive resistance. That lost, and the level of African American voting, even in Richmond, was very low. And the organization that was created came to be known as the Richmond Crusade for Voters. And it had a significant impact on city and state politics for the ensuing 40 years. It focused on registration and trying to educate voters about the candidates, and its power came from the pulpits and the other business leaders in the African American community, and its sample ballot released in the churches and on the streets the weekend before the election typically produced wildly lopsided returns in African American precincts in Richmond and increasingly across the state. Similar groups were created in Norfolk, called the Concerned Citizens for Political Education, and in the rural communities along the North Carolina border, called the Independent Voters League. But the number of African Americans actually registered still lagged behind, and difficulties in registration continued. Next slide. Here's a letter or a report from an organizer trying to register voters in a South Side, in a rural community along the southern tier. We were able to get 69 people registered this week, and appeals will be made in each church on Sunday to see that all the unregistered voters register as soon as possible. The time of registration in this particular community, 12 to 3, and the poll tax are our major obstacles. We have no success in getting those numbers, meaning either the poll tax or the hours of registration, changed so that a greater number could be registered. That was typical across the South, across Virginia, and really across the South. But it began to change with a little known meeting that was called by then Attorney General Robert Kennedy in his office in the spring of 1961. It was the era of the Freedom Riders, where African Americans and supporting white young people were boarding interstate buses in order to demonstrate that they could, in fact, travel across the South under the then existing law. And lots of problems resulted from that. Go back a slide. Somehow that got slipped a slide. And Kennedy called a meeting in his office and said, the president, his brother, is getting a lot of pressure from Democratic Southern governors about these freedom rides. And he tried to encourage those who had gathered there, many of whom were the young leaders of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, tried to encourage them to tamp it down some, and suggested instead that they focus on registering voters. These were young people. They had their own ideas. They thanked the Attorney General, left the meeting, and did both. Freedom rides were increased in number and intensity, but out of that meeting was created something called the Voter Education Project. And its founding person was a Fauquier County resident, man and wife, Stephen Currier, and his wife, Audrey. Audrey was granddaughter of Andrew Mellon, and their foundation pulled together funding from other national foundation sources, sought and achieved the cooperation of all of the major civil rights organizations in order to get a coordinated South-wide effort of voter registration underway. And they were successful at doing that. Let's see from the next slide. In Virginia, these are not big grants, but just in Virginia, there were 19 grants in that first year across the southern tier of Virginia. Relatively small, 1,000, 2,000, 5,000, but in those days, that would pay for part-time voter registration people going door to door, registering African American voters. And the success of that was made easier by some changes that were occurring in the law. The poll tax was outlawed in federal elections in 1964, and its use in state elections was struck down and it stopped in 1966. And then, most importantly, the tragedies of the Birmingham bombing and the incidents on the bridge in Selma led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, and the results were dramatic. The Voting Rights Act outlawed literacy tests and other forms of discrimination, such as getting somebody to interpret a section of your Constitution. And the statute required most Southern states to pre-clear with the Justice Department any changes in the state election law. Next slide. Lots of impact. Here are the registration, African American voter registration numbers before and after the passage of the Voting Rights Act in communities across the state. Arlington doubled. James City County almost tripled. Norfolk went from 10,000 to 15,000 African Americans just in that year and a half. These were important, critically important numbers, as you'll see in the next slide. The precincts that have been singled out for each of those cities are predominantly African American precincts. The impact of the African American vote in those individual precincts and in the cities in larger numbers of precincts. In Richmond, 15 precincts are predominantly African American. The total votes in 1973, over 10,000, 96% of that vote went to Henry Howell, the candidate supported by the Richmond Crusade. In Norfolk, 10 precincts, 9,700 plus votes, 91% went to Henry Howell, the candidate supported by the Committee on Political Education. These kinds of percentages were repeated time after time, election after election, not only in Virginia, but across the South. And elections are, after all, numbers games. It ain't rocket science. The person who gets the most votes wins. And the numbers were piling up, and those numbers came to dominate every election, beginning with the election of Chuck Robb as governor in 1981. Let's shift to the next slide. The other factor that's going on while all this is happening in voter registration is the dramatic shift and change in population growth. Northern Virginia, and I don't need to say this to this audience, Northern Virginia was exploding in growth. Arlington and Alexandria first, then Fairfax, more recently Loudoun and Prince William, and even into Stafford and Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania. Between 1960 and 2020, Northern Virginia's population increased 453%. Meanwhile, other parts of the state actually lost population during that same period, and large parts of the state that were key to the old organization's support, were the ones that lost population, particularly along the North Carolina border. While the rise in the African American vote was critical to turning the politics more in the direction of the Democrats, it was this kind of inexorable, slower population growth that caused the fundamental shift of the state's politics. And this growth was mostly from outside. Next slide. Remember, we said back in 1930, only 84% of the people in 1930 had been born in Virginia. Well, now it's less than half. That change in where people are from, where people had been born, where they grew up, has had a dramatic, even if relatively slow, impact on Virginia's politics. Let's shift again. Next slide. Comparing two counties as proxies for the differing growth patterns in parts of the state. Before Fairfax began to grow in the 1940s, Pittsylvania County was the most populous county in the state. In 1950, Pittsylvania County gave the organization candidate in the 1951 gubernatorial election, gave the organization candidate a 3-to-1 vote in the fall election against Republican John Dalton. I'm sorry, Ted Dalton, his father. Virginia population in 1950 was 3.3 million. 1980, Virginia population had gone up by 2 million. Fairfax had multiplied by 6-fold. Pennsylvania had actually shrunk a little in population, although the Republican candidate, Marshall Coleman, got a majority of the vote. That majority of roughly 2,000 votes was overcome by what Chuck Robb was able to gain coming out of Fairfax County alone. By 2005, the numbers were more akin to what you see today, and that is Tim Kaine came out of Fairfax County with a 60,000 vote margin, and Jerry Kilgore, the Republican candidate for governor in 2005, Pennsylvania was one of his best counties. He came out of Pennsylvania with a 4,000 vote lead, completely overwhelmed by the numbers coming out of Fairfax County. Kaine was really the first Democrat to gear his campaign almost entirely in the urban corridor. He knew that he could get a majority of the state if he did well in the urban corridor. As this shows, he came out of Fairfax with a 60,000 vote margin. Mark Warner, 4 years earlier, had only 26,000 vote margin coming out of Fairfax County. The county had changed that much. Together.
But John,
yes.
Can you describe where Pennsylvania? Someone wants.
I'm sorry. Yes,
yeah,
Pennsylvania County is if you go straight south from basically from here, to Danville, then Pittsylvania County is the county that surrounds the city of Danville. It's right on the North Carolina border, but it's one of the larger counties along the North Carolina border. US 29, Lee Highway extended, goes down through Charlottesville and straight south through Pittsylvania County to North Carolina.
Okay, thanks.
The dividing line, Fairfax and Arlington gave Tim Kaine together a majority of 105,000 votes. He won the state by 113,000 votes. He won the state in Northern Virginia in the urban corridor. So the question becomes, pretty obvious one, who are these people? Who are the 4 million people that were the growth factor in Virginia's population that has had so much of an impact? Next slide. Well, they arrived initially to work in the New Deal and beginning in 1941 to work at the Pentagon, accelerated obviously by World War II and its aftermath. They came mostly from northern states and the Midwest with a very different cultural and political background than the longtime Virginia residents who then populated the entirety of the state. And importantly, as the government grew, so did the population, and new jobs in government spawned a large number of contractors, particularly in the defense field. And these were people who worked for government, or their cousin worked for government, or their neighbor worked for government. And they were not, government was not a them, it was us. And they were not afraid of it. They understood it, and they were unhappy with political candidates who criticized government for the most part. And most importantly, they brought their own ideas and values, especially relating to children and education and family and neighborhood issues. And so beginning in the 1950s, slowly, inexorably, as growth continued and accelerated, these new ideas, different cultures, different political backgrounds, took root and began to dominate the politics, first of the localities in Northern Virginia, then of the state as their numbers grew so significantly. Next slide. Importantly, while the population was changing and its politics were changing, it both reflected a change in and accelerated a change in the economy of the state. The things that I have listed there as 19 and 20, each number here reflects the contribution that professional or economic sector makes to the overall state economy. Agricultural, forestry, fishing, and hunting and mining, 19 and 20, were the dominant factors in the state's economy up through and including most of the 1960s. They now have slipped as government, those professional, scientific, and technical people often who surround government in their contractors, the real estate that serves government, those became the dominant factors in the economy, not just in Northern Virginia, but when you think of the economics of Hampton Roads and the dominance of the military and the military-related businesses and contractors that are a significant factor in Hampton Roads, the state as a whole shifted in its economic priorities. In the 1950s and 70s, all these new people who came here, they voted Republican in the 50s and into the 70s because that was how you expressed anti-Richmond sentiment. In the 80s and 90s, their votes were kind of up for grabs, but since 2000, they've leaned heavily Democratic. And their numbers have changed the politics of Virginia, have changed the economy of Virginia, and continue to do so. Here's a reflection of that. Next slide. The two colors on this slide are equal in population. Perhaps there's no more graphic a way to show where the numbers are in the state's politics and hence where its politics are. Next slide. Let's compare where we, with the slide that we started out, the 1920 snapshot of Virginia, with the 2020 snapshot in Virginia. Population gone up fourfold, or 3.5-fold anyhow. Percentage of African American in the population decreased as a proportion to around 12.5%. Percent born in Virginia, as I said, it's gone from 84 to now less than half are born here. And we do have two very strong competing political parties. And importantly, the percentage of people participating in the state's elections is much higher than it had been all up through the 1970s. Next slide. So I'll talk very briefly about the elections in this century. I mentioned Mark Warner. Mark Warner was the last Democrat to have a successful pitch to both rural and suburban, urban Virginia. He needed to do that. When he ran in 2001, the numbers were not strong enough solely in the urban corridor for a Democrat to win. And Warner more than held his own in the more rural areas of the state, particularly the far Southwest. The next three Democratic governors took a different tack. Kane, McAuliffe, Northam, all three pitched their campaigns and successfully won their campaigns almost entirely in that stretch of Virginia that starts in Northern Virginia, goes down through Fredericksburg to Richmond, and then turns east through Williamsburg and into Norfolk and Portsmouth and Virginia Beach. The so-called urban corridor of Virginia is what a Democrat needs to carry in order to, and carry success heavily in order to win a statewide election. The two Republican successful candidates for governor, Bob McDonnell and Glenn Youngkin, combined the two with success. Both McDonnell and Youngkin had a credible pitch, particularly to Northern Virginia, but also to Virginia Beach. McDonnell grew up in Northern Virginia and represented Virginia Beach in the state legislature. Youngkin grew up in Virginia Beach and was in business in Northern Virginia. So they ran reasonably well. They didn't win, but they ran reasonably well in Northern Virginia. And McDonnell and Youngkin both carried Virginia Beach. But the real story for Youngkin in particular was the overwhelming percentages of vote that he got in the dozens and dozens of rural counties across the state. Not atypical for him to have gotten 80 plus% of the vote in a rural county in Southwest Virginia, or along the I-81 corridor, or somewhere down in the northern neck, or along the North Carolina border. Combining those two factors, strong support in the rural areas and credible support in the urban corridors, are what a Republican now needs to do in order to win a statewide election. It's not only possible now, but into the foreseeable future, as the growth numbers in Northern Virginia have slowed, and there's even been a little bit of growth having shifted to some of the smaller cities in the western part of the state. But we really won't know the much answer to that until we've got another election or two behind us, and the 2030 census numbers. So I'll end up where I started out. The story of Virginia politics in the 20th century is the story of two Virginias. The one dominated by rural interests across the state, and the one now dominated by the urban corridor. And I'm happy to take questions, comments, thoughts, observations, etc.
Yeah, so here's one question. From Dale, so was Nixon's Southern strategy, was that a success in Virginia?
Well, if you measure it as did he carry Virginia, the answer is yes. Virginia had its own Southern strategy, and that was really what Dick Obenshain succeeded in doing when he combined the old Byrd organization, which was the sort of Bourbon aristocracy of Virginia, with the conservative wing of the Republican Party. That was Nixon's strategy, that he would forego some votes in the urban areas and among more liberal Republicans in order to solidify support in the South.
Okay, thanks. Also, do you know if the population of Northern Virginia, since COVID and more remote working, is declining? Are there more rural areas seeing population growth?
The short answer is yes, but the numbers are very small so far, and of course, still very early. And we don't have real numbers. We have demographers' projections of numbers and sort of anecdotal numbers from some individual jurisdictions.
Well, okay. Another question is, did whites have to also pay the poll tax, and how much was the poll tax? Okay, I don't know if we
David,
lost.
I think we lost him.
Okay, that's what happened. Okay, I wasn't sure. Okay, I think we have lost. Have we? We still have our audience. Well, let's see if he is able to sign back in. And I don't know the answer to this question. So let's hold on. But I appreciate everyone being with us. Maybe we can hold on for a few minutes and see if he's able to find his link and sign back in. I think it's been a fascinating presentation. Another question, do you know the extent to which blacks voted in federal 1964 elections? No poll tax, but not in state or local elections. Well, okay, we'll save that for our speakers. But I mean, I think one of the things that, okay, here's someone knows the answer to the poll tax question. So the poll tax, it often was paid the machine often paid the poll tax for the white supporters. So there you go. That's how it worked. We don't know exactly how much it was and how much of a barrier it was, but it certainly, I thought that was very interesting, the time he spent on just the number of impediments that there were to essentially keeping down the black vote. I didn't realize just how profound those barriers were for African Americans. So I found that very interesting. I think the other interesting thing for me is that, the parties of Democrats, Republicans have actually shifted in terms of what they have stood for in Virginia over most of the South. And I guess as a voter, you kind of had to recognize that. And if you're a segregationist, for example, you would switch from the old Democratic, where I say the Democratic Party during the 60s and before, to the Republican Party at some point. So obviously, they don't stay static, Republican or parties, in terms of what they stand for. So, well, here's actually Sandra asked, did Southerners become Democrats due to Lincoln's presidency, and Democrats become Republicans due to Kennedy and Johnson voting rights? I think that's absolutely correct. So that's with those two big shifts as far as voting populations moving from one party to another. I suppose from what I've read, you also have another shift now with the populist party of Donald Trump drawing in a lot of working voters that, okay, John's trying to get back in. So that's, I think that's his wife, Chris Milliken. So let's see if we can just hold on a little bit longer. Maybe you can answer some of the questions that people have posed, although we've done a decent job, I think, with people chiming in their knowledge. So let's see. And I think, the forecast, I know I looked at some of these statistics. Okay.
John is back.
John is back with us.
Okay, John, I think we filled the time a little bit.
Welcome back, John.
I'm very glad to have you back. Hello? Okay, maybe you're muted. Are you muted? We can't hear you yet.
Yes, sorry.
Okay, great. So we do have some questions. Thanks for managing to get back in. So let's see here. One of them, do you know the extent to which blacks voted in federal 1964 elections when there was no poll tax, but not in state and local elections? So I'm not sure about that last part, but
well, there was in the federal election, but at that point, 1964, the number of African Americans registered in the state was relatively modest. It was better than it was in 1960, but it was still fairly small. And because the Voting Rights Act had not yet had the impact because it hadn't been passed yet. So the real impact of the African American vote didn't come until after the passage of the Voting Rights Act.
Okay, thanks. And I know you kind of touched on, we'll see what happens in the future, but I mean, what predictions are you willing to make as far as the trends in Virginia? We obviously had the Youngkin election. You talked about how he was able to do better than past Republicans in Northern Virginia and carry Virginia Beach. I guess that might be the strategy, or what twists
has to be the strategy. If you're a Republican, you've got to do two things. You've got to make sure that your core support in the rural areas is strong, so that whatever set of conservative principles will appeal to the rural vote across the state, you've got to adhere to, whether it's guns or whatever it happens to be. But that's not enough. You can run up the big numbers in the rural areas across the state if you don't have a credible message for suburban and urban Virginia, but particularly suburban Virginia, Virginia Beach, Fairfax County, Prince William, Loudoun, James City County outside of Williamsburg. And if you don't have a message that resonates in those areas, you're not going to win.
So the candidate does matter, at least in Virginia for now.
Absolutely right? Matters. And at this point, we don't have any idea who the Republican candidate will be. Both the Republican Attorney General and the Republican Lieutenant Governor are certainly plausible candidates. They've won statewide before, but who may emerge as their nominee, I don't know. It's clear the Democrat will be Abigail Spanberger, and she's already running hard.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's right. Yeah. So actually, I'm going to throw one last question at you, and you can demur or tackle it if you wish. So on the presidential side, maybe we just stick to Virginia. Some of the polls show them neck and neck, even though Biden won handily last time. We have this, same two candidates. I mean, is Virginia in play this time around, or what?
I don't know the answer to that, obviously, but I don't think it is. But there's going to be a lot of ups and downs between now and November. The first of which comes Thursday night with the first debate, and like most states, 85+% of the people who will vote already have their minds made up. Maybe it's a larger number than that. So that the campaigns are pitching a small segment of the electorate, one, to make sure that they vote, or that their supporters among them vote, and then two, persuading those few that have yet to make up their mind to vote one way or the other. Turnout will be critically important, particularly for the Democrat, because if the Democratic base doesn't turn out, whether it's Virginia or any place else, the Democrat's not going to win.
Okay, thanks for that insight, and we very much appreciate guiding us through the history of Virginia and explaining where we're at now and a little bit of glimpse into the future.
Happy to do it. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, really, and obviously our audience is showing a lot of hand claps, thumbs up. So I think there is much appreciation there as well.
Thank you.
Yeah,
thank you.
And thank you, the audience, for tuning in. And we hope you join us next month as well. So with that, I hope everyone can maybe try to stay cool or enjoy the summer as best you can. So thanks again, John. Appreciate it.
Thanks, David. Thanks to Chris and Donna.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, John.
Yeah. Take care.
Bye.
Very good show. Thank you.